I think my first involvement with the film was probably a call from Mike Fennell. And I'm sure he outlined uh, the, the basic parameters of what they were looking for. Joe and maybe Mike too had an interest in stop motion. A lot of the people who make these pictures, grew up with these Ray Harryhausen films, and they have a certain soft spot for that look. Although a lot of times, it ends up not actually being used by some of these filmmakers now that they're making movies. But in any case, I think it was not just that they had a disposition to the look of stop motion, but I think they actually had a real problem in having these werewolves move about in their movie, because in the initial conception of the picture, there was apparently tested but rejected for use a werewolf costume that they suited up and camera tested, and I never saw the test, but I was told that it looked like a guy in a bear suit or something, and was felt to be, I'm sure, too literal and too stiff or something. So they decided, probably because they would have been restricted by the human anatomy of somebody in a costume, to try something different. And they had built for them, I'm afraid I don't remember who it was, they built a large 7 or 8 foot tall, like kind of a lever-controlled, lever-action werewolf full-size mannequin, which looked something in proportions to this puppet that I made later on. In other words, although I shortened and fattened the legs somewhat when I made this puppet, the plan that they outlined to me was to shoot this full-size figure, operating it with sticks out of the elbows from behind, and a lever attached to a fulcrum behind it to make it rear up and so forth, that they intended to use this, and I'm sure it had some mechanical controls in the head and so forth. I saw the thing on the stage one day. I didn't examine it too closely. But in any case, they probably felt they could get some kind of a verite action scenes with this full-size thing. But obviously it was stuck to a stand, and it couldn't actually walk around and this sort of thing. Not that might not have been made possible through blue screen and rod puppetry and these kind of things, but they weren't prepared to do that. But they felt they would have had to have some scenes where the werewolves were seen in the complete surround, where they could walk about and so forth. And they felt, since this was the look of their werewolf, not something that a person could be suited up in a costume to duplicate in proportions, that they would probably have to use stop motion. Whether, I'm guessing they might have not minded stop motion, but even if they did, I guess that was the only alternative in those days they could imagine. So they got a hold of me, maybe because of John Davison, who I knew in those days, and he might have told them to call me, I don't know. In any case, I began to make this puppet. Roger Dicken, who is an English effects man, he sculpted most of this under my direction at the studio I had in Burbank, and it was based, as I say, on this big Baku-style rod puppet. And at this time, the film had other werewolf effects. Rob Bottin had made, I believe, a hand puppet of a head and neck, which I recall some scenes of it, like trying to fit its way through a half roll-down window in a car and snap at people who were inside. But initially, the film was fairly modest in how the werewolf effects were going to be created. I think it was, you might say, maybe more story or performance driven. I think the werewolves were almost certainly much more implied than they are in the film now. And so I was hired under those circumstances to make a puppet to show a few explicit scenes of the thing so that people would believe the other scenes, Specifically, they asked me to do a scene of the werewolves in one of the scenes in the picture being locked in a barn, and then the barn being burnt down with them inside. Well, sometime during this period, the film was reviewed by the studio, and they decided that they would like to have another try at doing the werewolf suit idea. And at this time, I think Rick Baker and Rob Bottin had began looking very aggressively at the problem of how to actually create a physical morphing effect with a man into a werewolf, where they could actually do jaw extensions and hair being pulled through in reverse, and all of these ideas. I think Rick and Rob sort of kicked these ideas back and forth, how an actual transformation might be affected on camera, of course with cuts, but actually seeing it rather than doing it with dissolves and things like the old days. That was a big reason, I'm sure, that the film is still talked about today, were the on-screen transformations of the werewolf with Dee Wallace watching. And none of this was really in the wind when I was hired. I mean, this was something felt that for interest, and I'm sure for production value, they were going to create these brand new scenes, and a whole new suit was constructed and so forth. And I'm sure it intercut badly. If you cut the scene that I did of the werewolves reacting inside the barn to the fire as it starts up, and then later on to when the inferno is kind of overcoming them, there's a big difference not only in the stop motion, which tends to have its own reality, that's undeniable, but there was also other differences. In the look of the lighting of the barn, I recall their lighting was much more low-key, more blacks and deep umbers and things, where the light was falling off. Whereas in mine, because I was assuming the flames were going pretty strong, I had it really kind of overlit by comparison to the way they lit their actual barn interior. So you had lighting mismatches as well, I think. And in any case, the scenes that I did were delivered and paid for. You know, they seemed to like them. And as an afterthought, I had done a scene, it wasn't even on the budget, of a plate that I made when they were shooting at Griffith Park one night, of just some, they had a fog machine blowing heavy fog around, and I shot a plate of it. And I did a scene of the werewolves standing in front of this. It's the only thing that survives of the work that I did in the picture. And it's used in a kind of a montage. It's kind of like the center element of a three-element dissolve. I don't think it ever completely comes into full exposure. It's just a fragment of the three werewolves, sort of one of them baying up at the moon, presumably, at the very end of the picture. So they got some use out of the puppets that were made, but of course the bigger scenes that I worked hard on weren't in the picture. And Mike had the unpleasant, distasteful job of calling me in the studio and telling me that that they had decided that it wouldn't really be appropriate for the picture, you know. But I talked to Joe in later years, and I think we were all pretty clear about what happened, you know. Although I never did work for them again.